Hey there, it's Susan Pierce Thompson and welcome to the weekly vlog. This week I want to address a comment. This is the first time I've done this, I think, that it was a post in the BLE official, Bright Line Eating official Facebook group that came up recently, and it goes like this. Susan, I'm not a bright liner, still a skeptic. I know people lose weight. The issue, as you know, is the long-term maintenance. How do you make sense of your own intense, continued, or resumed struggle with food cravings when you've been teaching that going sugar and flour free heals the brain, so that those kinds of cravings should not still be the issue? I do understand that the rest of your system creates automaticity and that your schedule and work life make that not automatic. So I'm not in any way feeling critical of you, just doubting the brain healing thing. No need for a personal message, but I hope I see you address this somewhere. Signed, Michelle Soloy, RN LCSW. I reached out to her, asked if I could address this in a vlog because it actually got me thinking about some things that I'm pretty sure I've never thought of before, therefore have never put into a vlog before. And she's from St. Louis, Missouri. She said that it's fine if I use her full name. And yeah. So, Michelle, thank you for your comment. So what this got me thinking about that I don't think I've ever realized before is that when I first started this whole bright line eating thing, when I got the idea in my morning meditation, write a book called Bright Line Eating, and I set out on that endeavor. At the time, I was in a 12-step program for food and addiction, and I had been there for 11 years, I believe, and I'd gone years and 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 years without a single bite off plan. And the environment that kept me from picking up a single bite of food off plan was an environment with a threat of punishment. Now, in psychology, we talk about punishment being something that decreases a behavior. And in this case, it decreased it down to 0. The punishment would be that if I picked up any bite of food off plan, I would lose all of my sponsees, I wouldn't get to speak at meetings anymore for 90 days, and I would lose all of my service commitments in my various meetings that I was sort of really involved in. And also my social standing in the community would drop to practically 0. Everyone would be like, oh, did you hear Susan had a break, and blah, blah, blah. And the environment where that would happen if I picked up a bite off my food plan was in place all those years. And it was really effective for me. It turns out I'm kind of a social status minded person. I didn't know that about myself, but it turns out I am. I really care what people think about me. God bless me putting out these vlogs every week, and I do read the comments, so I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing, but we'll set that aside. So what happened was when I left that program and stepped into a purely bright line eating universe where none of those disincentives exist, something happened that psychologists would have predicted. I'm surprised I never thought of this. Here's what we know about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. If you reinforce or reward people extrinsically, like you set up an outside environment, it will powerfully motivate their behavior. But as soon as those extrinsic rewards or punishments aren't there anymore, the behavior stops. Like basically, people go back to baseline. And so when I stepped out of the environment where I was subject to those extrinsic forces, suddenly I realized that I realize now, looking back, I had not built up the intrinsic motivation to do this thing. Like it had been an extrinsically motivated system. layer in a second piece, Michelle, like you pointed out, suddenly I was subjected to all kinds of stressors that I hadn't had before. Lots of travel, eating out on the road all the time, suddenly having employees, which I never expected. Blah, blah, blah. My life got orders of magnitude more complex and more stressful than it had been before. Another factor that came in the mix around the same time was suddenly I started coaching people in bright line eating from a scientific basis. And what I realized was that the sort of folklore that I had come of age in a 12-step program didn't really pass muster necessarily from a scientific perspective. I had been taught we don't eat hummus, we don't eat nuts, we don't eat seeds, we don't eat beans, we don't eat cherries, we don't eat grapes, we don't eat soup, we don't eat on and on and on. And I knew that there was no real scientific reason for any of those things. We don't do intermittent fasting. We don't eat 4 meals a day or 2 meals a day. We only eat 3 meals a day. We don't this, we don't that. And suddenly when people started asking, what do you think about the science on intermittent fasting? Can I do 2 meals a day? I have an autoimmune disorder and I am convinced by the science. I want to try that. And suddenly I didn't know what to say. Like, well, the history I'd come from was, no, we don't do that. That's not good for a food addict, but there was no scientific grounding for that. So what happened was over the first few years of bright line eating, amidst the removal of the extrinsic motivation to keep perfect with my bright lines, and amidst this increased stress, I started to experiment with certain things. Well, what happens if I try 2 meals a day? Does that work? Does that not work? And there's old vlogs where I'm like, okay, I'm trying water fasting. We'll see how this goes. I'm like, I haven't eaten in 3 days. And people are writing comments like, what do you mean you're trying water fasting? You're the beacon of bright line eating. You should be doing no such thing. And I was like, well, I know, but people ask me, what about water fasting? And I didn't feel right saying yay or nay on any of that unless I had a more embodied opinion about it. Here's the thing, research doesn't distinguish between food addicts and non-food addicts in any of this work, right? So on what grounds was I going to coach someone who is super high on the susceptibility scale and trying to maintain a large weight loss that something is or isn't likely to be problematic? So I started doing a lot of research. And so, Michelle, your question is really about cravings, food cravings, and whether or not the brain heals. Well, to be precise, I don't have food cravings. That's not actually what's going on when in the past I've broken my bright lines. What's happened is a slippery slope phenomenon where I'm exposed to an environment where I'm not weighing and measuring, or the food is unstable or insecure. I'm traveling, I'm in a restaurant, I'm this, I'm that. And a slippery slope happens where through more exposure to more sexy foods, I find my food going a little off and then a little more off, and before I know it, some part of me goes, I think I might be over the line. So it's not so much that it's like the old days where it's 2 in the morning and I'm putting on my coat in winter to go to a convenience store to get some food because I'm driven by powerful cravings. It's a little different than that. And I will say that I actually experience freedom most of the time. Like I'm, thank goodness, not thinking about what I've eaten or not eaten. I don't know, 95, 98% of the time. Once in a while when things get really stressful and I find myself again in a situation that is more unstable, exposure to sexier foods or sexier food situations like restaurants can lead me inchy by inchy by inchy by inchy down a slippery slope where I find myself feeling unmanageable again. So I want to go back to the essence of your question, which is really about, does the brain heal? And what does that even mean? I talk about this in a lot of webinars that I've given, and I think I've talked about it in vlogs too, but the essence of what I mean when I say the brain heals is as follows. If you have neural pathways or fiber tracts in your brain that are of an addictive sort, they're like a river that is water flowing over dry land that over years and years and years of cue, behavior, response patterns has grooved a riverbed. And when you look to do something like bright line eating, it's like damming that water upstream and then forcing it in a new direction, which at the beginning feels scary, uncertain, and very unfamiliar, like a bunch of water flowing over dry land with no riverbed. But if you keep at it, over time, you groove a new riverbed. That presence of a new riverbed in the recovery direction, writing down your food the night before, eating your 3 meals a day, or however many meals you eat, and not eating sugar and flour, and taking care of your morning routine and your evening routine, all of that together constitutes a new riverbed in the new recovery direction. That right there is the healing of the brain. The old riverbed is still there. It's just dry. But it's there waiting. Which is why the susceptibility quiz says, think back to a time in your life when your eating was at its worst and answer these questions from that vantage point. Because however deep and powerful that riverbed was back then, it's still there. You're still susceptible, you're still eligible, and if you let water back in that old direction, it comes back, sometimes shockingly quickly. Now, the reality that some of us do at times for short lengths of time, long lengths of time, experience profound freedom is evidence that these new riverbeds can be incredibly powerful. And if you have an identity shift upstream that creates a very strong dam, you can actually live out the rest of your life without ever dealing with those old patterns again. You just let the water flow in that new direction one day at a time, and those 1 days at a time add up. And if you're like me and sometimes you do some things that are destabilizing, or you run experiments and then you're finding that they turn out to be the equivalent of letting water run in those old riverbeds, and you find yourself with what feels like a return to old patterns, then, we talk about things like resume and what it takes to get back on track. I do want to say at the end here in closing that I think it's an interesting thing that I stand before you talking about bright line eating, and I haven't had a perfect journey. I know that in the program that I was in before, at the annual meeting, they have one large group meeting. All the delegates have come from all over the world, and they have one meeting. And to speak at that meeting, you have to have 15 years of perfection with your food. Never a baby carrot off plan to speak at that meeting. And that is one approach. That is one approach. And through careful consideration, that is not the approach that we take in bright line eating. And whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing that the person who's giving the weekly vlog here doesn't have a history of perfection is really sort of your own, it's like, I think a lot of people are going to think a lot of different ways about that. I have personally had moments, especially years ago, where I was horrified that my journey wasn't perfect and I was standing in front of you every week. And what I've found in retrospect is I'm not horrified anymore. What I notice is that the bravery that it takes to share a journey that's less than perfect is, in many ways, I feel the voice of compassion that is most needed when we deal with really, really challenging addictions. And because we eat every single day, and food is in our face every single day, I think it's pretty sweet that we all join together here, letting reality be what it is. And our journeys look different. So, yeah, thanks for your question, Michelle. There's a lot of nuance to it. That's the weekly vlog. I'll see you next week.